hearing on the Coast Guard. I look forward to our discussion on budget oversight of the United States Coast Guard. The need for this panel to hear from Coast Guard leadership could not be more urgent. Every individual who raises their right hand to serve our country must be assured that they're joining a service that is worthy of their bravery and dedication and is led by senior officers who exemplify the highest ethical standards. As we recently learned, the Coast Guard failed in providing this assurance. A years-long investigation into allegations of sexual assault and sexual violence at the United States Coast Guard Academy uncovered a painful history, but failed to result in any accountability, and was not disclosed to this committee for the better part of a decade. This is disturbing and unacceptable. The Coast Guard not only failed to properly investigate, prosecute, and report criminal acts of assault and rape when they initially occurred at the Academy, but failed again to prosecute or discipline the perpetrators during the subsequent investigation referred to as Operation Fouled Anchor. To say that I am disappointed in the conduct of these senior leaders is an understatement. Coming forward to report sexual harassment or assault takes courage and bravery. But when those allegations are swept under the rug, it's insulting, re-traumatizing, and a further disservice to the victims. And the survivors who came forward at the Coast Guard Academy, in many cases, not once but multiple times, have had their disturbing assaults ignored. They deserve better. They deserve accountability, transparency, and justice. I will work to ensure that this committee delivers just that. The unconscionable failures of justice that occurred at the Academy are not isolated events. They are a symptom of a larger cultural problem in the Coast Guard of sexual harassment, sexual assault, and cronyism that stands in the way of accountability. Additional allegations in recent years that the Coast Guard failed to prosecute and report instances of sexual violence that occurred on commercial U.S.-flagged vessels raise serious questions about the Coast Guard's ability and, frankly, willpower to comply with laws and demand accountability. I have heard from a constituent whose traumatic experiences were not taken seriously by this Coast Guard. What I say to her, as well as to all service members who were failed, I am deeply sorry for what you experienced. I am grateful for your bravery in coming forward, and I'm committed to seeking justice. I'm further concerned that we have not yet heard every story, nor provided every victim throughout the service with a safe environment in which to come forward. What is clear is that there are deep-rooted issues at the Coast Guard, and we owe it to our service members and the American public to get answers and to get substantive change. I am fully committed to working with my colleagues on this committee, as well as with you, Admiral Fagan and Master Chief Jones, to remove this scourge from the United States Coast Guard. Also today, time permitting, we will discuss other matters of oversight that will inform the drafting of the next Coast Guard authorization bill. These matters include items important to our Coast Guard families, such as access to adequate and affordable childcare, housing, behavioral health supports, and related quality of life concerns. We will consider the budget request for fiscal year 2024 and the Coast Guard's ongoing major acquisitions program, such as the Great Lakes Icebreaker. I would also note that while the Senate Appropriations Committee has not yet marked up the Department of Homeland Security bill for fiscal year 2024, we know that that's a tough road ahead. There is a tough road ahead for shared priorities. Admiral and Master Chief, thank you for being here today. I look forward to hearing from you about how Congress can invest in the Coast Guard's most important resource, its people, and how we can work together to better serve those who serve our nation. With that, I will hand it over to a great advocate for the Coast Guard and a great colleague, Ranking Member Sullivan, for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for your leadership in calling this important hearing. I'd like to welcome Admiral Fagan, Master Chief Jones, and I'm eager to discuss the capabilities and challenges facing our United States Coast Guard. Today, we come together to assess the Coast Guard's operations, capabilities, and challenges to ensure that this indispensable military service is equipped with the resources, support, and guidance it needs to fulfill its vital role. The Coast Guard's mission set is wide-ranging and very demanding. It simultaneously plays roles as a military service, a law enforcement agency, a regulatory agency, all in allowing the organization to execute its missions. This broad mission set requires bravery, resilience, and tireless pursuit of excellence from Coast Guard men and women. I stand committed to the safety and security of our nation's waters and recognize the unwavering dedication of the men and women who serve in the United States Coast Guard. We have made tremendous strides in recent years to modernize the Coast Guard cutter fleet, enhance readiness, and adapt to an ever-evolving threat landscape. The National Security Cutter Acquisition Program has matured, and some of those assets are in the fleet doing great work. Last Congress, we authorized an additional $650 million for continued acquisition of offshore patrol cutters, 2 of which will be home ported in Kodiak, Alaska. But one area where we are desperately lagging behind competitors, particularly Russia, is our ability to operate freely in the Arctic. America is an Arctic nation because of Alaska. My state is on the front line of competition in the Arctic and serves as a safeguard for the United States against such threats emanating from this critical region. I have long emphasized the important role the Coast Guard plays in ensuring that we counter the authoritarian aggression of the hostile regimes in Russia and China. At no point was this more evident than last September, when a group of Chinese and Russian naval vessels operating together off the Aleutian Island chain in Alaska was posing, in my view, an unnecessary threat to our state and country. Continuous presence in the Arctic is essential to this effort, and the Coast Guard must be able to operate in the Arctic at will, the way the Russians do. To help ensure that we can do so, I included a provision in the FY 2019 National Defense Authorization Act to authorize the construction of 6 polar-class icebreakers, polar security cutters, as the Coast Guard calls them. And this committee later reiterated that support in the Coast Guard bill. I'm excited that we were able to move forward with the acquisition of these critical assets, and we're starting to build them. But I have serious concerns about the delays in the production of the polar security cutters and the impacts to our nation's security that these delays can cause. Last year, I helped authorize $150 million for the procurement of a commercially available icebreaker to help bring the United States additional offshore ice-breaking capability long before the delivery of the polar security cutters, which we are building. While the appropriations for that icebreaker were included in the Coast Guard, included in an appropriations bill at the last minute in the omnibus last year, still trying to figure out why, they were removed, literally, at the last minute. I'm confident that we will secure the funding for the Coast Guard to purchase this much-needed icebreaker in FY 24. It is in the President's budget, again, as it was last year, and I'm glad to see it will be home ported in Juneau, Alaska. Admiral, I look forward to continuing to work with you on that. Last month, Admiral Fagan and I, with Senator Murkowski, traveled to Alaska for the 17th Coast Guard District Change of Command ceremony in Juneau. We also visited Coast Guard facilities in Cordova and Kodiak, where we saw firsthand the struggles the service was facing in recruiting and retaining members, both in its military and civilian workforce. I know that the service is working hard to address recruiting and retention issues, but there is still much work to be done. The service has missed its recruiting goals for the past 4 fiscal years and continues to struggle to keep members within the organization. Retention issues are particularly high for personnel stationed in remote areas, especially in Alaska. Admiral, you and I got to see that firsthand a couple of weeks ago. Access to healthcare providers, affordable housing, and childcare remain challenging. These challenges decrease the quality of life for Coast Guard members and may influence their decision whether to remain with the Coast Guard or not. Additionally, Coast Guard members, unlike their counterparts in the other military branches, do not have the guarantee of being paid during a government shutdown. This is completely unacceptable. To fix this, I have repeatedly introduced different versions of the Pay Our Coast Guard Act, but a permanent solution has not yet been managed to get a floor vote. You have my commitment to continue to work on that with both of you. Admiral, I know that you are taking actions to address the recruiting and retention issues on your end. Be assured I'm working to do what I can to ensure the Coast Guard members will continue to get paid the way the other services do in the event of a government shutdown. Lastly, like the chairman who issued a very powerful, heartfelt, and important opening statement, I must express that I'm deeply disturbed by the recent news about the travesties that occurred at the Coast Guard Academy. There's no place for sexual assault, sexual harassment in our society, particularly not in our military. It is essential that members of our armed forces feel safe, and it is unacceptable that institutions and leaders that were supposed to protect them failed to do so. Furthermore, when the Coast Guard failed to disclose to Congress the receipt of these reports and subsequent investigations, the service obstructed our ability to conduct vigorous oversight. This is what we are doing right now. This is exactly the type of gross mismanagement that congressional oversight is designed to protect against. This cannot be allowed to happen again. Thank you, and I look forward to the valuable insights and discussions that will shape the future of the United States Coast Guard.
Next, we turn to Ranking Member Cruz for his opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Ranking Member Sullivan. Admiral Fagan, Master Chief Jones, welcome. Your leadership is critically important today as the Coast Guard grapples with its inaction and the failure of transparency regarding past sexual assaults at the Coast Guard Academy. By not taking appropriate action to address past sexual misconduct at the Coast Guard Academy, the Coast Guard tragically failed to protect its most valuable assets, its people. Cadets entering the Coast Guard Academy commit to making great sacrifices in the service of their country and humanity. And yet, when the worst happened to them, the Coast Guard failed to return that commitment. A recent investigation of sexual assaults at the Coast Guard Academy found that many sexual assaults at the Academy were not taken seriously, and that the perpetrators of these crimes were dealt with administratively rather than criminally. More than 60 potential victims were identified in these investigations. The Coast Guard's insufficient action or outright inaction has caused further trauma for these victims and has blunted proper accountability for those responsible for these crimes. Moreover, the Coast Guard kept these investigations hidden from Congress for years, 3.5 years, delaying reporting the findings of the investigations to Congress. Admiral, you and I talked about that last night. That failure of transparency is unacceptable. We need to make improvements to ensure that this failure to notify Congress does not happen again. And you can be sure that this committee will be conducting rigorous oversight to ensure that these improvements are made. We owe our brave Coast Guardsmen, men and women, a workplace free from sexual assault and harassment so that they can focus on their critical work of saving lives, intercepting drugs, and defending our maritime border, which is more important now than ever. For years, I've worked on a bipartisan basis with Senator Gillibrand to protect members of the military from sexual assault. Together, we led the fight to enact into law the Military Justice Improvement and Increasing Prevention Act, which professionalized and improved how the military prosecutes sexual assault and other serious crimes. Senator Gillibrand and I also teamed up in a bipartisan way to enact into law the Cadet Act, which ended the unfair and antiquated policies that forced female students at America's military academies, including the Coast Guard Academy, into 3 terrible choices if a female cadet became pregnant. Either forcibly getting an abortion against her wishes, going to court and legally surrendering her parental rights over her child, or withdrawing from the service academy and repaying the federal government the cost of her entire education. This made no sense. It was frankly an idiotic policy, and I'm very glad that we were together able to pass in December the Cadet Act, changing that policy so that now women at our service academies, if they choose to be mothers, can be mothers to their children and can also serve and defend our nation at the same time. It is imperative that we work to ensure the dignity, the well-being, and the safety of our military members, including cadets who will one day form our officer corps. In Texas, Coast Guard members are on patrol 365 days a year. From Station South Padre Island to Sector Houston, Galveston, and beyond, Coast Guard members stand the watch to keep our citizens and our nation safe. Earlier this year, I introduced a resolution commending the Coast Guard for its outstanding work in safeguarding the American people through promotion of national security and maritime border security. It highlighted that during fiscal year 2022, the Coast Guard interdicted over 400,000 pounds of narcotics and over 12,000 illegal aliens, while conducting over 6,000 at-sea boardings of fishing vessels and stopping 87 foreign fishing incursions. In addition, the Coast Guard ensures economic security through rigorous vessel inspections and by keeping commerce moving in and over our waterways. At a time when our allies need clean U.S. energy abroad, I hope that Admiral Fagan can commit today that the Coast Guard will work expeditiously with the Maritime Administration to complete processing deepwater port license applications. The Coast Guard also plays an important role in setting schedules for drawbridges. In doing so, it must balance all the public interests of mariners, drivers, and road builders to keep the people and goods moving in all modes of transportation without compromising safety. The Coast Guard must work with all stakeholders in advance of changes and not impose a schedule that is impractical, even on a temporary basis. For example, a recent schedule change on a drawbridge on a rail corridor along the east coast of Florida threatens stoppages that would cause freight rail service to block nearby grade crossings and severely restrict the operations of passenger rail services. I understand a proposal has been offered by the railroads that would provide mariners with access to the waterway for 60% of the daylight hours. The Coast Guard needs to promptly adopt a workable schedule that recognizes all the stakeholders to give certainty to the mariners, the railroads, and their customers. I look forward to working with Admiral Fagan and Master Chief Jones to ensure that the Coast Guard continues its critical mission to safeguard our national security, our economy, and our way of life.
We will now turn to our witnesses for their opening testimony, starting with Admiral Fagan and then to Master Chief Jones. We will include your full testimony in the record of this subcommittee, so if you can keep your summary of those remarks to 5 minutes or less, that would be appreciated. Admiral Fagan.
Thank you. Good morning, Chair Cantwell, Chair Baldwin, Ranking Member Cruz, Ranking Member Sullivan, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity for Master Chief Jones and I to testify today, and I thank you for your continued support of the Coast Guard, and thank you for accepting my written testimony into the record. The world is changing at a pace that is constantly accelerating, and our commitments to protect, defend, and save grow every day, and demand for the Coast Guard at home and abroad has never been greater. On behalf of the Coast Guard, I thank you for your continued advocacy as we support our workforce and their families, recapitalize our fleet, and build vital shore infrastructure. Before taking your questions, I want to touch briefly on each of these critical areas. There are many factors that go into recruiting and retaining the world's best Coast Guard, and one of them is offering a safe work experience, free from harassment, bullying, assault, and retaliation. And in that regard, I want to address recent news reports of our failure to respond properly to sexual assaults that occurred at the Coast Guard Academy from 1988 to 2006. As you're aware, in 2014, we launched an extensive investigation into incidents alleged to have taken place during that time. The investigation grew from a single complaint to ultimately over 60 cases. And we took action in each of these cases in which we had jurisdiction and informed individual victims of our findings. We did not disclose the investigation or its findings to you, depriving Congress of opportunity to conduct proper oversight. In June 30th, Master Chief Petty Officer Jones and I sent a message to the entire Coast Guard workforce, acknowledging our failure and articulating the need to act. And I request that that message be accepted into the hearing record. I again apologize to each victim, survivor, their loved ones. We failed to provide the safe environment that every member of the Coast Guard deserves. And again, I apologize to the committee for our failure to notify. Our service and our academy have made much progress, incredible amount of progress, yet work remains to be done. This week, I initiated a 90-day accountability and transparency review of the service, led by a flag officer, to ensure we have a culture where everyone is safe and valued, and we are creating transparency and accountability. As Commandant, I'm committed to improving our prevention efforts, prompt and thorough investigations into reports of sexual assault and harassment, accountability for perpetrators, compassionate support to victims, and full transparency with Congress and the American people. More broadly, our service must adapt our overall talent management system to a changing world. Like all military services, we are experiencing a workforce shortage that threatens readiness and our ability to serve the American people. This year, we introduced groundbreaking new talent management policies that make it easier for our workforce to continue to serve. Today, we're recruiting at the fastest pace we've seen in the last 4 years, but we must do better. We're investing in new digital recruiting tools, opening new recruiting offices to reach more communities. To attract and retain a highly skilled workforce, we must properly support our sentinels and their families. We must invest to ensure pay and entitlements keep pace with the rapidly changing economy. And we continue to work alongside the Department of Defense and this committee to ensure access to health care, affordable housing, and child care. Beyond investing in the Coast Guard workforce, my investment priority includes ships, aircraft, and shore facilities. Our major cutter acquisition programs, including the Polar Security Cutter, the Offshore Patrol Cutter, and the Waterways Commerce Cutter, will enable our presence in the high latitudes, along our maritime borders, and our inland rivers. To support these new ships, we must invest in our shore infrastructure in their future home ports, particularly in places like Kodiak, Seattle, and Charleston. To ensure aviation readiness into the 2040s, we'll consolidate our helicopter fleet into a single platform MH-60 Tango. I ask for your continued support to ensure the Coast Guard, like every U.S. Armed Force, has the stable and predictable funding necessary for mission execution. I'm completely committed to the safety, support, and success of our entire Coast Guard workforce and their families, and to working transparently with Congress to achieve these goals. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Good morning. Chair Cantwell, Chair Baldwin, Ranking Member Cruz, Ranking Member Sullivan, and distinguished subcommittee members. It's an honor to appear before you as a Master Chief Petty Officer of the Coast Guard. I apologize for not providing a written statement. I would be happy to submit a statement after the hearing if you would be willing to accept it. As I begin, I would like to express my sincere appreciation alongside Admiral Fagan on behalf of our dedicated personnel for your unwavering support of our United States Coast Guard. The Coast Guard workforce is the heart and soul of our organization, and their dedication and sacrifices keep our nation safe and secure. Every day, Coast Guard sentinels put their lives on the line to protect, to defend, and to save. I want to echo the sentiment of the Commandant's opening statement and clearly state to this committee and the entire workforce that everyone in our service has a right to a safe workplace free from harassment, bullying, assault, and retaliation. Our workforce deserves nothing less. As we discuss the future of the Coast Guard, my primary focus is our sentinels, specifically the service's ability to recruit and retain the talented individuals necessary to effectively carry out the critical missions our nation demands and our nation deserves. Your continued support and advocacy have enabled our recent recruiting initiatives, which include opening 10 new recruiting offices, leveraging innovative technology to reach potential recruits, initiating 4 new JROTC programs, and developing the Scout Talent and Refer program, resulting in more active duty and reservist sessions at this point in fiscal year 23 than the entirety of fiscal year 22. This is our highest accession rate since 2019. We still have work to do, and your continued support will allow our recruiting practices and talent management policies to evolve in order to attract and retain the best young people our nation has to offer. The United States Coast Guard is more than a military service. We're a family. Our service members and their families become integral parts of the communities in which they live. With your support, we will retain our workforce and their families by ensuring access to affordable housing, quality mental and physical health care, competitive compensation, and modernized assets and infrastructure. These issues are vital to our sentinels and to their families. While I acknowledge that those who volunteer to serve are not primarily motivated by pay, it is essential to recognize that they may likely leave for better compensation elsewhere. The fiscal year 24 pay raise is a good step in the right direction and the most significant increase since 2002. To ensure we remain an employer of choice, we must continue investing in our basic pay scale. Your support of the Pay Our Coast Guard Act is crucial for the health of our service. The Coast Guard welcomes legislative parity with our DoD counterparts. We are thankful for the continued support of Congress to recapitalize the facilities at Training Center Cape May, our only enlisted accession point. The Coast Guard included a multi-purpose training facility at Cape May as part of our unfunded priorities list for fiscal year 24, which would enable year-round training and improve recruit throughput and our ability to develop resilient, fleet-ready sentinels. I want to reiterate the Coast Guard's critical role in protecting our nation's maritime interests and ensuring the safety and security of our citizens. Our mission supporting the Heartland's critical infrastructure and maintaining thousands of aid to navigation has never been more important. Of the $5.4 trillion that flows on our maritime transportation system each year, more than $4.5 trillion moves on America's western rivers. Among our many modernization and acquisition efforts, we look forward to deploying new waterways commerce cutters to replace an aging fleet of ships, some over 70 years old. The improved living conditions and ability to accommodate mixed-gender crews are a much-needed step forward. Your continued support is vital to our critical missions and overcoming these pressing readiness and modernization challenges. Rest assured that Admiral Fagan and I are committed to fostering a culture wherein our members feel safe, trusted, valued, and included. I am grateful for the unwavering commitment of this committee to support the mission to defend and safeguard America's vital maritime domain. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you for your testimony. We will now start a round of questions, and I will begin. So I want to start by reiterating my commitment to seeking answers, transparency, and accountability for the victims identified in Operation Fouled Anchor, and for all victims of sexual harassment and sexual violence across the Coast Guard. It is unacceptable that Congress is just learning about this operation now. Admiral Fagan, with your leadership of the Coast Guard, will you commit to working with this committee to examine how these significant failures occurred and why the operation was kept secret from Congress?
Thank you. I am 100% committed to this committee with regard to transparency, accountability, and bringing the service forward. The investigation that started focused on sexual assaults, historic sexual assaults at the Coast Guard Academy, represent a broader challenge for the service and for the Academy, and I am committed to bringing that work forward and being accountable to you and the committee as we work to improve the service so that everyone in the Coast Guard has access to a workplace and a work experience that's safe, respectful, free from sexual assault, harassment, bullying, hazing, retaliation, and that we have the full transparency and accountability that's needed to ensure that culture occurs.
And will you commit to holding accountable all individuals who perpetrated these abhorrent acts and all individuals who either failed to take proper action or who participated in withholding information from Congress?
So I am committed to accountability to the fullest extent of the law, and as in all cases where we've got jurisdiction and ability to hold accountable in accordance with the laws that are currently in place, I commit to working with the committee on that.
Okay. Admiral Fagan, as you know, Chair Cantwell and I sent you a letter on June 30th requesting all information in the Coast Guard's possession with respect to this operation with the deadline of tomorrow, July 14th. Admiral, can I expect a timely, complete, and fully transparent response?
Yes, Senator, you can expect a timely and complete response. We will have that draft to you and your team by tomorrow.
Thank you. During the course of Operation Fouled Anchor and since the completion of Operation Fouled Anchor, has the Coast Guard pursued any punitive or administrative actions against any of the subjects identified in the operation?
For those subjects that we had jurisdiction over, we did pursue accountability. The 90-day initiative that I've just shared with you will begin to fully look at how we are ensuring accountability in reports of sexual assault. We have made an incredible amount of progress as a service since the time frame of Operation Fouled Anchor. Investments in policy, in survivor support. We've stood up a special prosecuting office this summer to ensure that we're aligned with the other military services. But it's clearly not good enough, and we are going to get after the work that is necessary to ensure, again, transparency, accountability across the range of sexual assault, harassment, retaliation, and bullying.
And with regard to those who are identified survivors, what behavioral health or other support services were provided to those survivors identified during Operation Fouled Anchor?
The investigatory effort associated with Fouled Anchor was extensive. It was deliberate. I'm confident that within that body of work, we have been in full contact with the survivors. We continue to offer support, mindful of the need to protect their privacy, as they, experience the trauma again as a result of some of the reporting. But they have been fully offered survival services. We have invested in victim survivor services as an organization, continue to invest in. I expect we will have additional victims and survivors come forward in the weeks and months to come, and we are prepared to provide services to those individuals as well.
I want to now turn my attention to our enlisted members of the Coast Guard. While the focus of Operation Fouled Anchor was the Coast Guard Academy, these findings leave me concerned that similar failures may be affecting our enlisted members during basic training at Cape May or elsewhere across the service. Master Chief, what can you tell the committee about how the Coast Guard holds perpetrators of crimes accountable at the Coast Guard Training Center? And do you believe there are adequate supports in place to assist survivors and sufficient safeguards in place to ensure reports do not get swept under the rug?
Thank you, Senator. Similar to the comments that the Commandant made, we pay the same level of attention to our enlisted accession sources in Cape May. If and when anything were to come forward, we fully investigate. We fully focus on the victims, the survivors, to ensure that they have the same level of support that has grown and increased over the years to ensure that they have the support they need to get through this. And I commit to the committee that the same thing that applies at the Coast Guard Academy, we look to get better every day and strive for perfection every day, we make those same efforts at our enlisted training centers.
Thank you. Senator Sullivan.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to follow up on this questioning to begin with. Just as I mentioned in my opening statement, the Coast Guard Academy's handling of the sexual assault allegations in the 1990s is deplorable, unacceptable, and can't happen again. The fact that the organization knew that this had happened years ago but didn't tell anyone is also unacceptable. Admiral, I want to commend you for your June 30th message to all Coast Guard members. I'd like to submit that for the record.
Without objection.
And one of the things that you mentioned in that message to all Coast Guard members is that, and I think this is important, the investigation occurred between 1988 and 2006. Is that correct?
Sexual assaults were not being appropriately handled at the Coast Guard Academy when they were reported.
And then importantly, in the statement and in your statement today, and even in the questioning you just answered from the chair, you mentioned over the past several years we have made major improvements to our policies regarding sexual assault, and you list a number of them. I'm not going to have you list them all here, but I think that's important for people to understand that in the last several years you have made important strides. Can you commit to the committee as part of this hearing to submit for the record a very detailed listing of all of these major improvements? I'm not going to have you do it now, but I do think it's important for the committee and more importantly for members of the Coast Guard to know that and have confidence in that. Can I get your commitment to do that? As just consider that a detailed question for the record here?
Yeah, I commit to providing all of that to the committee.
As much detail as possible. Let me ask again, on the issue of the prosecution of sexual assault and sexual harassment out of the chain of command, as you know, that issue has been something we have been debating on the Armed Services Committee, on which I sit for almost a decade. I want to commend Senator Gillibrand in particular for her leadership on that. Has the Coast Guard undertaken similar actions, and were you required to by law, or was that another instance where the DOD had something different from the Coast Guard, but you've done it anyways? Your statement mentions that you're doing it, but I'd like to know the legal and statutory basis for doing that, and how is that going?
So the National Defense Authorization Act that required the stand-up of the special prosecuting attorney offices applied to the Department of Defense, not us. We have moved.
Not you.
It did not apply to us.
Okay.
We have moved to do exactly that. We have, last year we selected a one-star admiral. That office is being stood up in Portsmouth, Virginia. We're staffing it. This year it will be up and fully functional and provide complete alignment with the intent with regard to appropriate handling of sexual assault cases in the military. And it's been a significant effort, but it's exactly where we need to be as a service to ensure that we're taking reports of sexual assault seriously and that they're being appropriately adjudicated and prosecuted within the UCMJ.
So you did that even though you weren't required to under the law the way the Department of Defense was?
We did it because it's the right thing to do to ensure as a military service that we're meeting the needs of our members.
I think, Madam Chair, it's an issue we should probably look at whether or not we need to legislate just to establish that the way the other services have done. And then one more thing, and I think it's very important, and I know you've already said it, but it's really important for this committee. Can I get your assurances that this type of investigation will never again be withheld from the Congress?
Yeah, I fully commit that the not reporting this investigation is inconsistent with my commitment to transparency, my respect for the oversight that this committee appropriately exercises over the organization. I am committed to bringing the organization forward and ensuring that we've got the appropriate culture of transparency and accountability and are responsive to the committee.
Thank you. Let me turn to another topic that you and I have talked a lot about that I know matters to you. It certainly matters to me. It matters to our country, and that's the Polar Security Cutter Acquisition Program, the commercially available icebreaker to fill the gap. This is an issue that I think every American should care about, whether you live in Florida or Texas or Alaska. We are an Arctic nation, as I mentioned. The Russians currently have over 50 icebreakers and are building more. 50. Some of which are nuclear powered, many of which have serious weapons on them. And we have 2, and 1 is broken. I think we have less icebreakers in Singapore, and they're near the equator. This is just completely unacceptable. My time has expired, but Madam Chair, I do want to just ask, and I'll follow up in the second round of questioning. Admiral, you've been a strong supporter of both of these programs. Can you give me an update first on the Polar Security Cutter acquisition lags that we are seeing and what we are expecting in terms of the building of our own Polar Security Cutters? And perhaps I'll leave to the second round of questioning the commercially available issue that you and I have worked on. And again, I appreciate the Coast Guard working so hard to get that in the President's budget again. It was in the President's budget last year and somehow got removed at the end of the omnibus, which still rankles me. But on the lag time on the building of the Polar Security Cutters.
So thank you. We're committed to the Polar Security Cutter and that contract. We're an Arctic nation. It is critical to our national security, and we continue to engage in the Joint Program Office with the Navy to ensure that we field that critical capacity and capability for the nation. The shipyard that the contract was awarded to was recently purchased and is now owned by Ballinger, Mississippi. We're working with the owner on accelerating detailed design, understanding what and definitizing the schedule and any implications with regard to new cost estimates. I was at that yard just a few weeks ago. They've welded a test coupon. I am confident we are going to begin building that ship as we go into the next calendar year, early in the next calendar year. It'll be at least a 4-year project to build that ship, and I understand that puts Deep Freeze 2028 potentially at risk, but we continue to engage with the shipyard and with the leadership there to accelerate into the work that is critical to getting that ship building begun and then fielding and executing it on behalf of the nation.
Thank you.
I'm going to continue on the theme of ice breaking also on our fresh coasts. Admiral Fagan, for the second round, I want to turn our attention to the fiscal year 2024 budget request. As you know, we have been working with the Coast Guard for nearly a decade to acquire a new heavy Great Lakes icebreaker. This vessel is critical for all the types of activities on the Great Lakes, from saving lives and property from flooding to transportation that supports billions of dollars in economic activity. We need more icebreaking capacity. Despite efforts in Congress to allocate funding for planning and design as well as acquisition of long lead time materials, the Coast Guard still estimates this additional heavy icebreaker may be another 10 years from realization. This year, the budget request includes $55 million for the Great Lakes icebreaker. And I noticed that you included an additional request of $20 million in your unfunded priorities list. If Congress were to fund the full request of $75 million, would this help deliver the icebreaker faster? If so, how much sooner? Does the Coast Guard have proposals for the committee to consider to accelerate the acquisition process and progress for the Great Lakes icebreaker?
Thank you. We continue to make progress on the Great Lakes icebreaker, and I remain committed to fielding that critical capability into the Great Lakes. The economic benefit to year-round access is just essential to the economic well-being of the country. We've made progress. We've moved through the first phase of acquisition and are moving, into the next design phase. So additional money, the UPL money, would help with long lead time materials to begin to accelerate into construction of a ship. Just as with the Polar Security Cutter, shipbuilding is a complicated and complex process. We continue to work on design. I commit to fielding a ship that's at least as capable as the Mackinac. Hull form and technology has evolved in the 20 years since the Mackinac was built, and we need to make sure that we field the best, most capable ship, and remain committed to working with you and understand the urgency with regard to the need to move that acquisition forward.
Okay. I think all of us here would agree that our women and men in uniform are this nation's most valuable asset. And the families who support them on a daily basis are just as deserving of our respect and admiration. This committee continues to work to provide the Coast Guard families with appropriate services and support. Yet, I believe there's a significant capacity for improvement, particularly where our families are at rural duty stations. I personally discussed these challenges with members of the Coast Guard stationed in Wisconsin. Based on their feedback, I secured an authorization in last year's bill that would expand access to child care options by permitting the Commandant to implement a child care subsidy program that includes off-post daycare centers, family home daycare providers, and in-home providers. Admiral Fagan, can you please provide the committee with an update on this program and whether you require additional authorities or funding appropriations for full implementation of this program?
Thank you, and I want to thank the committee and you for your continuing support to ensure that our families have access to child care. And diversifying that access has been very well received to the workforce. And so the subsidy program has been exceptionally popular. It allows families to decide between, in locations where we have a brick and mortar Coast Guard operated child care center, they may use that as an option. They can use child care centers in the economy where they're located, and the subsidies are particularly helpful with that. And we continue to move to ensure then that we're able to incorporate in-home health care access as well. Child care it comes up at every unit the Master Chief and I visit. It is critical to the resiliency and readiness of the force, and look forward to continuing to work across the spectrum of access for child care with the committee and yourself, and appreciate that support. Thank you.
Thank you. And Master Chief Jones, as the senior enlisted advisor, you're in an excellent position to know what challenges impact service members and their families on a daily basis. I'd like to give you an opportunity to inform the committee of any additional quality of life items you wish to raise on behalf of members of the Coast Guard. What else can we do in this area?
Thank you for the question, Senator. As the Commandant said, everywhere we travel, we hear about its access to affordable and quality housing, mental, physical health care, access to child care, the things that will allow our Sentinels to ensure that their families are taken care of so they can focus on the mission at hand. That is a true force multiplier. And while that is the common theme anywhere we go in our Coast Guard, they have the unique different challenges depending upon the area where they are. And just with the child care being a great example of the flexibility. Some places the brick and mortar child care, some places the subsidies. What works one place doesn't always work somewhere else. So we just truly appreciate the support of the committee for those flexibilities in those areas so we can meet the needs of our members and their families.
Thank you. Senator Sullivan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Let me go back, Admiral, to the issue of all the icebreakers. I think, can you commit to this committee to give let's call it a every 6 months update on the Polar Security Cutter and the Great Lakes Security Cutter that you just mentioned? I think it would be good to have regular updates on those acquisitions and building programs.
No, I commit to providing regular updates. Thank you.
Okay. Let me turn to the commercially available. This was the idea started in the Trump administration. This committee was supporting it. The Biden administration continued it. The idea of purchasing a commercially available icebreaker to fill this gap. In the 2022 Coast Guard Authorization Act, we authorized the transfer of NOAA land in Juneau to the Coast Guard, which the Coast Guard would use to home port the commercial icebreaker once it's purchased, in addition to other activities. Can you provide an update on the NOAA land transfer in Juneau that will support home porting an icebreaker, and perhaps give a timeline more broadly on, assuming we get the appropriation this year for that purchase, what would you see as kind of the timeline? I know we have other infrastructure needs. I can confidently say between this committee and the Appropriations Committee that we will be able to support what the Coast Guard needs for that. But finally getting an icebreaker in America's Arctic is going to be really important, not just for Alaska, but for America. As I mentioned, we are getting, in terms of strategic competition and great power competition in the Arctic, it's not even close. We need presence. We need ships. We need icebreakers in particular.
Yeah, I am 100% committed to the commercially available icebreaker, and when appropriated, we look forward to operating that vessel on behalf of the nation. Once the appropriation is made and we're able to procure the icebreaker, and you alluded to it, right, there will be some initial work that needs to be done on the vessel to bring it to an initial operating capacity and allow us to begin operating it in the Arctic. And we're working to understand cost for life cycle cost and maintenance cost with regard to that vessel, and we'll continue to work in the committee as we work to field that critical capacity needed now for the nation. We are working through the real property acquisition discussions. I can provide with you a timeline as to where we actually are with regard to the property in Juneau. As you know, we saw it recently on our trip up there, and look forward to providing the committee with the timeline and financial support needed to ensure that we've got infrastructure in place to operate an icebreaker in the high north.
Great. Well, just keep us posted. We want to stay ahead of that on this committee. We don't want to be the ones behind on that. Let me ask another question. The 2022 Coast Guard Authorization Act contained a key provision from my Arctic Focus Act directing the Coast Guard to report on the ability to conduct a transit of the Northern Sea Route and periodic transits of the Northwest Passage. What are the capabilities of the Coast Guard to make a Northern Sea Route transit, and what lessons can be learned from the recent Northwest Passage transit?
So we continue to operate the icebreaking capacity we have. Healy, our medium icebreaker, will depart, or has departed, or will depart Seattle shortly for another transit through the high latitudes and Arctic. Lessons were learned from her last transit, which was a complete circumnavigation, and happy to provide you and your staff with any lessons or insights with regard to Healy's recent operations. As Polar Security Cutter comes online, it'll obviously create more opportunity and capacity for that kind of presence and learning opportunity as we operate more persistently in the high latitudes.
Great, thank you. Let me ask, turning to another acquisition program. The Coast Guard has done much to recapitalize its fleet over the last 15 years. I want to compliment the Coast Guard. The National Security Cutters and the Fast Response Cutters are performing way above expectations and are doing great work for this country. However, the OPC program is significantly behind schedule. Can you provide an update to that, Admiral? And are you confident that the recent timelines that you have put forward on OPC delivery, including the two which, as I mentioned, will be home ported in Kodiak, are coming online soon enough? And again, the NSCs and the Fast Response Cutters are doing a great job, and perhaps you might want to touch on that as well.
Yeah, thank you. The national security cutters have been we've been operating them for 10-plus years now and have been incredibly capable ships. And you know that we are able to periodically operate the national security cutters in the Bering and other locations, just providing great capability and presence. Fast response cutters, same kind of increased capability and capacity. And, you know, we'll have fast response cutters. We have fast response cutters operating in the state of Alaska. The offshore patrol cutter that Argus is OPC-1. We have experienced some delays in the launch of OPC-1. There was a shafting issue that's resulted in a delay of several weeks, and we believe Argus will be launched by the end of this year, and that's a likely year delay in delivery date. OPC and Polar Security Cutter are my two top acquisition priorities. They're absolutely essential to the nation. The offshore patrol cutter is replacing, you know, ships that are 50-plus years old, the 210-foot cutters and 270-foot cutters, and so continuing to move forward with speed and intent on the OPC is a priority for the organization. I look forward to seeing Argus in the water soon.
Great, thank you.
I'm going to take the chairwoman's prerogative to ask another question before turning it over to Senator Warnock for his questions. I will have to depart for an appropriations markup, and we'll turn the gavel over, but let me just do a couple additional questions before I depart. There is an angle to the Operation Fouled Anchor that I failed to ask you about earlier that I want to just make sure that I don't leave aside. And that is, we've talked about the perpetrators who have been identified, we've talked about the victims, but we haven't really talked about the Coast Guard leaders who ignored some of the information they were collecting. And so, according to the Coast Guard, the previous leadership chose not to pursue investigations into other leaders with knowledge of sex crimes who failed to investigate, and in some cases failed to prosecute offenders. According to the CNN reporting, in some cases, leaders insultingly disciplined sexual assault survivors for lewd acts. So, Admiral, in one case, I understand a Coast Guard attorney responsible for providing legal advice to Coast Guard leaders recommended that a rape case be referred to a hearing under military court. The attorney advised that failing to do so is, quote, tantamount to declaration of an open season on women. Yet, the Coast Guard's own investigation found that Coast Guard leadership did not heed that lawyer's advice and failed to refer the case to court-martial. So again, we've talked about the victims, we've talked about the perpetrators, but how will the Coast Guard respond to an egregious lapse in justice like the one that I just described?
The pattern of failure to address sexual assaults reports at the Coast Guard Academy. Sexual assault was a crime in the 1980s, and it is still a crime. And there was a lack of policy clarity and clarity of leadership with regard to how those reports needed to be handled, investigated, how the victims needed to be supported. We failed, the cadets at the Coast Guard Academy at that time period. Moving forward, I'm committed to ensuring that we've got full transparency and accountability in the system, not just for perpetrators, but for leaders who fail to abide by the policies that we've got in place to ensure that we provide a safe experience and environment for everyone in the workforce.
Thank you, Admiral. Now, different transition. The Coast Guard has the unique role of providing for U.S. safety at home as well as abroad. In light of increasing competition in the Indo-Pac theater of operations, Senator Schatz and I sponsored a provision in last year's Coast Guard bill that directed a collaborative study of the Coast Guard's resourcing needs with respect to operations in the Western Pacific. Additionally, I supported the fiscal year 2023's provision of funding to select an existing cutter to relocate to the Pacific Theater, tasked specifically with Indo-Pacific operational support. So Admiral, can you please describe for your increasing presence in Indo-Pac and focusing on opportunities for the Coast Guard to support the President's Indo-Pacific strategy for a free and open Indo-Pacific, and on resources you require to continue this work?
Thank you. The demand for your Coast Guard has never been greater, and it's certainly true in the Western Pacific as we operate national security cutters, fast response cutters based out of Guam, and there's opportunity for us as a nation to make additional investments in the Coast Guard that creates increased presence, partnership, and capacity building. In our UPL, you'll see 4 fast response cutters. That's a direct acknowledgement of that type of capability and access might create greater presence throughout that theater where we can engage with the individual island nations to support the Indo-Pacific strategy. You mentioned the Pacific Support Tender. That cutter has been identified and will be a re-home porting into Honolulu for the next couple of years to begin operating and providing that critical work in support. And she should be in Honolulu by December. And we look forward to continuing to explore with the committee and the administration on how we might invest in the Coast Guard and increase our persistence and presence in the Western Pacific.
Senator Warnock.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, Admiral Fagan and Master Chief Jones. I appreciate you being here to help us understand the Coast Guard's needs. As you know, Georgia is proud to be home to more than 500 Coast Guardsmen located across the state, including at 4 stations located in Tybee Island, Georgia, Savannah, Georgia, my hometown, Brunswick, Georgia, and Kings Bay. These Coast Guardsmen are valuable members of our communities, and their service is critical to protecting the lives and the property of Georgians all along our coast. This is especially true during hurricane seasons, which have been getting worse due to climate change. As global temperatures rise, scientists believe hurricanes will cause greater rainfall and higher storm surges, threatening our coastal communities and requiring more robust federal emergency responses. Admiral Fagan, how is the Coast Guard preparing to respond to the growing intensity of storms and other consequences of climate change on our coastal communities?
Thank you. We continue to look for opportunities to increase resiliency around our forward shore infrastructure. I published a climate framework to provide clarity and focus to the organization across the suite of challenges we have associated with climate change. Specifically, we use NOAA's sea level data to ensure that as we rebuild infrastructure after a hurricane, that it's done in a way that is more resilient and acknowledges likely impacts to sea level rise. After Hurricane Michael, several of the stations then that had sustained only minor damages because we had rebuilt them in a way more resilient to climate change, and we remain committed to improving infrastructure resiliency, particularly as it's associated with storm intensity and sea level rise.
Thank you so much, and it's difficult to overstate, or maybe impossible to overstate how important this is. And it's important for the federal government to be able to respond to the reality of climate change that we're living through now. To another subject altogether, I believe it is important that we provide our military services with the tools they need to successfully perform their missions and come home to their families. I'm concerned about long-range surveillance capability gaps that could result from a lapse in upgrading to the HC-130J aircraft, given no additional aircraft were requested in the budget request. The HC-130J provides surveillance in support of search and rescue missions maritime law enforcement, and marine environmental protection, and is vital for Coast Guard operations, as you know, in the Indo-Pacific. That is why I was proud to send a letter to Homeland Security Appropriations Committee requesting continued support for the Coast Guard's efforts to upgrade to HC-130Js. Admiral Fagan, how would delayed or reduced HC-130J modernization affect the Coast Guard and your mission?
The C-130J is an incredible aircraft, and as we have fielded them at air stations, particularly in Kodiak on the West Coast, the added legs availability in airtime of that aircraft has been a game-changing for search and rescue, surveillance. We've indicated desire for an additional C-130J in our UPL request. We have a program of record of 22 for that aircraft and continue to work with the committee and here to ensure that we bring those aircraft online as funding is appropriated for them. They've been just incredible assets as they help with logistics, surveillance, and across the mission suite that we conduct as a United States Coast Guard.
Thank you so much. It's important that our service members have the equipment that they need, and I look forward to supporting the Coast Guard through the budget process. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Warnock. I'm going to have a few final questions before we wrap up this hearing. Admiral, actually, and Master Chief, I want to get your views on the recruiting challenges. And by the way, all the services are having recruiting challenges, as you know. What actions has the Coast Guard taken to address your recruiting challenges, and what do your projections show about the health of your workforce moving forward?
Well, I'd like to thank the committee for the support that we have received to help address some of the recruiting challenge we've faced as an organization. We've been able to increase recruiter capacity, open new recruiting offices, and begin to just elevate awareness of who we are as an organization. We have made significant progress in recruiting. At this point in the year, we have onboarded more people into Cape May than we did the entirety of last year.
Good.
But there is still work to do. The talent management, workforce management work that we have embarked on will help make the service more attractive and to retain those members that we bring in. I am committed across the suite of levers that we have to recruit, make the service attractive to those who have a propensity to serve, and then to retain those members and their families once they've entered service. And again, I really appreciate the support that we have had, and we will continue to lean into.
And my understanding is your retention rates are actually pretty good. Is that true?
The retention rates are
re-enlistment. I mean retention.
They're good. We have had a slight uptick in sort of decrease in retention in this past year. It is unclear at this point what that is a result of. Is it a kind of a re-leveling post-COVID? I don't know. At this point, I'm satisfied with where our retention numbers are. This is really an initial recruiting challenge for the enlisted workforce, in which one of the reasons why the Cape May investments become so critical as we continue to onboard that enlisted force into the service.
Do you have a view on the recruiting issues, Master?
Thank you, Senator. In addition to all the comments that the Commandant made, other investments are with our recruiters. We've invested in software that allows them, it's quicker to get from contact to a young member to actually getting them signed up and into boot camp. Those investments has helped. Thank you very much to the staff there. The wonderful news that we have is, while we don't have enough people coming into Cape May, the quality of human being that's coming into our United States Coast Guard is second to none.
Good.
I mean, they're absolutely the best this country has to offer. We need more. So we are very excited in that capacity, and we're doing a lot of efforts internally in the organization to where we simply tell our story better. We, as serving sentinels, do a better job. As the Commandant says quite often, when people know about the Coast Guard, we've got them. They love the Coast Guard. They want to be part of
Well,
the
let
Coast
me
Guard.
follow up with a related question. The Coast Guard Act of 2022 required the Coast Guard to maintain at least one JROTC program in every Coast Guard district. How do you view this as a potential recruiting tool to tell your story, and can we expect to see a JROTC program in Alaska soon pursuant to that Coast Guard Authorization Act provision from 2022?
We have been onboarding JROTC programs as well, and we're moving deliberately to expand those programs. We intend to comply with the Coast Guard Act. Look forward to working with your staff on where that is timing-wise. It has been a great tool for increasing awareness of who we are as a service, and look forward to continuing to increase investments in the JROTC program.
Great. Let me turn to another topic, Admiral, that you and I have talked about a lot. I have a very comprehensive bill that the Coast Guard helped my team and I and Senator Whitehouse's team draft. It's called the Fish Act, which is all about going after IUU fishing and the importance of combating IUU fishing as it relates to sustainable fisheries, but also, let's face it, strategic competition with the Chinese Communist Party, which directs these gray fleets that ravage fisheries throughout the world. Oftentimes, countries in Latin America or in Africa, the only recourse they have to even trying to combat these Chinese fleets is assistance from the United States Coast Guard. Can you tell this committee the importance of that issue as it relates to our fisheries, but also strategic competition with China? I'm trying to get our Fish Act marked up here in the Commerce Committee soon, and I want to get a sense from you how you think that's an urgent issue. And I want to thank the Coast Guard for helping my team and Senator Whitehouse's team draft a lot of that bill.
Illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing is a global issue. Several years ago, the Coast Guard published an IUUF strategy to bring focus and alignment to the global scourge that is IUU fishing. We have worked to provide leadership across regions where IUU fishing is occurring. We've got great examples where bilateral fish rider agreements between the United States and a small island nation provide a great way to take that nation's organic sovereignty and law enforcement authorities over their own fishing stocks. That person comes onto a Coast Guard cutter, and we are able to help them provide a presence and, again, enforce their own sovereignty and protect their natural resources. We continue to engage, across the globe with other Coast Guards and navies to work to bring regional alignment to IUU fishing. It's a sovereignty issue, it's a theft issue, and left unchecked, it erodes the norms of maritime governance, and it needs to be addressed.
Let me end here with two questions relating to Alaska shipping, and then I see our chairman is here as well, which is welcome. Can you give me an update on the Waterways Commerce Cutter Program, and more specifically, the home porting decisions for the replacement for your inland buoy tenders, one of which happens to be located in Petersburg, Alaska, and I've worked with your predecessors on making sure Petersburg has coverage. That's a really important community in my state, a great fishing community that's also been very supportive of the Coast Guard over the years.
The Waterway Commerce Cutter is a critical acquisition for the nation. The cutters that we will replace with that acquisition program, some of them have been in service 70 plus years, that we owe our workforce and the maritime transportation system updated, current, modern waterway commerce cutters. And we'll continue to work forward with that acquisition to field those. And I've got a sense of urgency around the need to replace that capacity. We'll come to you and your staff with regard to we're still working through the phasing and home port decisions and laydowns as those ships come online, and happy to provide you details on.
Okay, that's an important community in my state to continue a Coast Guard presence. So I'd like to get details from you, Admiral, and your team on that one as it relates to Petersburg. And then second, you and I talked about this when we were traveling with Senator Murkowski recently, and this relates to the Coast Guard asset in the city of Valdez. In 2021, Valdez was designated a Coast Guard city. As you know, that's not easy to do. You got to meet a lot of important commitments to do that. The city is very proud of that designation. Unfortunately, the city is concerned that the Coast Guard has no plans to replace the U.S. cutter Liberty when it retires in a few years. And as you know, Admiral, since you've spent a lot of time out there, this is a really strategic area for Alaska, but also for America. The Trans-Alaska Pipeline terminates at the Valdez Marine Terminal, and that's a very significant amount of the nation's oil supply. Valdez is the northernmost ice-free port and supplies military munitions to 5 U.S. military bases located in Alaska. The Port of Valdez is a very large salmon fishery, handles close to 70 million in fish exports annually, and the port handles cargo and needed logistics equipment for major gold mines and mining in Delta and Fairbanks, and construction equipment for resource development throughout the state, including the North Slope of Alaska. And perhaps we can discuss this in more detail. I'd like the Coast Guard to look at extending the life of the Liberty in terms of its being ported in Valdez, and look at other replacement options, and maybe some ideas that you have that the city and municipality of Valdez can do to partner with the Coast Guard to get a new vessel. So can I get your views on that? Just you and I have talked about it, but I'd like to get your views.
Thank you. And we remain focused to the commitment with regard to the fast response cutters that we're in the process of fielding in Alaska. The fast response cutter is a much more capable vessel than the 87s. The 87s frequently experience, weather limits. As you know, it's a demanding operating environment up there. But I commit to working with you as we continue to look at how we meet our response requirements throughout the state of Alaska, and understand the criticality of Valdez, particularly with the oil terminal in the salmon fishery. But look forward to working with you to ensure that community has appropriate coverage.
Great, thank you. Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Sullivan, and thank you for anchoring this hearing. I want to thank Senators Baldwin and you for holding the hearing to begin with, and the subcommittee's great work. And as you and I know, the Coast Guard is a critical part of the Northwest economy, the Northwest life, and everything else, and so we value them very, very much. Admiral Fagan, glad to have you here, and Master Chief Jones. I feel like we took 2 giant steps forward with women in the Coast Guard. Giant step forward when Coast Guard realized that 40% of its workforce were women, and said, we got to have the most progressive child care, family leave policy in all branches of military. And then when we were able to vote out your nomination and get you before the full Senate and have you be the first woman as the head of an armed service, there was real celebration from my colleagues. So it is heartbreaking, maddening, frustrating, and intolerable where we are today with this sexual abuse and assault within the Coast Guard. Cannot tolerate the fact that the Coast Guard did not notify us of this. We cannot have the media be the policeman on the beat, and I'm going to ask for an IG inspection so that we can get to the bottom of all the problems that have occurred here post the knowledge and information. Now, I understand that you and relatively new, how many months now on the job?
13 months.
13 months. And people are saying that a lot of this took place from 2014 to 2020, but there are also reports that there are things that have happened as recently as 2022. So I need to hear from you, what do you think are the necessary steps to really give everybody a full accounting of what's transpired, and your recommendations on how we are going to fix this, and what is the reasoning why Congress wasn't notified of this situation?
We failed the committee when we did not disclose in 2020. I'm the Commandant now, and I am committed to that not happening again. And I'm committing to moving forward in a manner that's consistent with the transparency that I strive for as Commandant and that you expect as the Oversight Committee. I've initiated a 90-day transparency and accountability review to understand what are the aspects of the culture that have allowed this to occur. It started as legacy sexual assaults that were mishandled at the Coast Guard Academy, but it is clear to me that we've got a culture in areas that is permissive and allows sexual assaults, harassment, bullying, retaliation, that's inconsistent with our core values. It is not the workforce that I want or expect, and we have got work to do. We've made a lot of progress. We are not where we need to be, and that is the work that is in front of us, and I am taking it up with a sense of urgency. I commit to the committee that I will regularly report on the progress, and we'll work with you as we work to improve the climate for every member of the workforce so that they have a workplace and a workplace experience that's safe and secure, and that this ends.
Well, Admiral, it's very frustrating to hear that you think there is a culture of assault at the Coast Guard. And this is not going to be tolerated. It's not going to be tolerated by us, it's not going to be tolerated by the American people, and we are going to hold people accountable. And one of the reasons we were excited about your nomination is because we thought it was going to usher in a new era. And I want to understand what you think the principles are for changing that culture now. But we are going to hold people accountable.
So we do not have a culture of assault in the Coast Guard.
I think the exact words were legacy of cultural, well, we'll get the actual record.
There was a legacy of mishandling of reports of sexual assault at the Coast Guard Academy in the 80s. We have made an incredible amount of progress as an organization investing in policy, victim support, how we investigate and hold accountable those perpetrators. We are not the same organization today that we were in the 1980s, but we are not where we need to be. Just like on a ship when you have rust, we've got pockets of rust that need to be eliminated from the organization to ensure that there's no silence around it, that every victim feels safe coming forward, that they're supported, and that what the end goal is that we have 0 sexual assaults in the organization.
So what are the 3 things that you are undertaking to make sure that happens?
The team that I'm putting together will start with looking at everything with regard to accountability, where we are with the UCMJ, changes in law around ability to prosecute sexual harassment as well as sexual assault, looking at our training system on how we are educating, how we're talking about it, and the full host of levers that we've got as an organization to ensure that we're where we need to be, that the leaders understand their responsibilities, that they move to acknowledge low-level behavior, comments, things that are not appropriate, and begin to create a permissive environment for more egregious activities to go on. And we're going to look at any and all of it and move it forward. We're not where we need to be, despite all of the great work, the establishment of the Special Prosecuting Attorney's Office that we're standing up this summer to move to align with the other military services with regard to how sexual assault will be handled, taking it into a special prosecutor and outside of command lines, but we need to continue to move forward. We're not where we need to be.
What do we need to do at the very beginning of the academy to make sure that we're rooting out this kind of behavior?
The academy will be part of the review, and there will be specific then tools and levers that we're going to need to use with regard to the academy. I'm going to ask the new superintendent to embark on some of that effort so we can understand exactly where we are with the academy and how do we ensure that that behavior does not continue to occur at the academy. And this is a very different Coast Guard Academy today than it was in the 1980s. The experience that I and many of us had in the 80s compared to the experience that more recently, as you know, my daughter's a graduate, she had, and the new class that's there now, we're light years ahead of where we were, but we're not where we need to be.
So what is your understanding of the lack of disclosure to Congress?
I don't understand why we did not disclose. When I found out about the totality of the fouled anchor investigation, I directed that we move to begin notifying.
And when was that?
It was when the CNN investigation started asking questions. That was when I first became aware of the totality of the fouled anchor.
So did you know about it before, or you just thought it was one or two cases, or what triggered this awareness for you?
So I knew generally of fouled anchor, I needed to move to temporarily relieve a commanding officer while I was the PAC area commander. It was one instance, and I knew it was part of a greater body of work, but I did not know the full extent. So when the team said, we've got these Freedom of Information Act requests, and it became apparent to me the deliberation, the effort, the victim advocacy and support that went on as part of that, when I found out the total extent, we moved to disclose.
Well, I just want to be clear. If I could pass one bill, the entire Congress, it would be the Cantwell-Bozeman bill that supports journalism, because I think journalism gets us competition, perfect information, and is a watchdog. But that is no excuse for the Coast Guard not having a handle on this, and it's not the way you should receive information. So what is it about your structure that you think you need to change now that you know that all this was below you and you didn't have full visibility to it?
Yeah. So this is part of the work we need to do, is understand what was known and how do we ensure this does not happen again. I'm committed to transparency. I'm committed to the committee. I'm going to provide regular updates, reports as we delve in to the body of work that's needed to ensure that we don't have this happen again.
And would that include relieving people of positions?
I need to understand whether we've got jurisdiction to hold accountability, and there's.
Why wouldn't you have ability to hold somebody accountable if they didn't inform you or kept information from reaching the highest ranks?
Though I may not have jurisdiction over those that would have been in a position to make those decisions, they may have moved out of the service, and that's all part of what we're working through.
Okay, well, I'm still asking for an IG investigation. We had a similar incident, not an incident on sexual assault, but an incident where 4 young firefighters lost their lives. And we very much appreciated the Forest Service looking at what went wrong. But we could see that the previous fire, the same things went wrong, and then no one culturally implemented them. So we're going to get third party involved here to make sure that we have the oversight, the evaluation, and that Congress has transparency into the situation and what we need to do. So I could go on to ask you other questions, but I don't think so. I don't think I have the stomach to ask you other questions about the Coast Guard budget. This is such a serious matter. We have to fix it. I think those 2 giant steps forward need to be real steps forward. I don't know if my number was correct on 40% of your workforce being women today. Is that?
It's 40% at the Coast Guard Academy. The overall number in the force is probably closer to, it varies by rank, anywhere from 10 to 25%.
Okay, so what does that mean? We're taking in 40% and not graduating them, or is that?
So at the Coast Guard Academy, the intake and graduation percentage is a great news story, and it's a very different Coast Guard Academy than what it was in the 80s. The class we just onboarded, I think, was 43% women, the largest number of underrepresented minority males. It is an incredible academy. These are great young Americans, and policy and access to reporting and care has improved dramatically, but we have work to do.
Master Chief Jones, do you agree this is an intolerable situation?
Absolutely, Senator.
Okay. And do you have any further comments about what you think the Coast Guard should be doing here?
In line with what the Commandant said, our goal is to get up every single day. We strive for perfection tomorrow. We are better, but better is not good enough, and we won't accept until we make our Coast Guard the best it can absolutely be. Every Sentinel has the right to feel safe, trusted, valued, included, and empowered in their workplace, and that's what we strive for every single day.
Well, this needs to be a cultural change, and so I hope that you are going to put your full effort into this as well.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This concludes our hearing. The hearing record will remain open for 2 weeks until July 27th. Any senators who would like to submit questions for the record should do so by July 27th. We ask that your responses be returned to the committee as quickly as possible and in no case later than 2 weeks after receipt. Again, I want to thank you, Admiral, Master Chief, for your testimony today. And I want to once again, on behalf of the U.S. Senate, please make sure you're telling the men and women of the Coast Guard how much we appreciate their outstanding efforts keeping our country, our fishermen, our coasts, so many Americans safe. Such an important service, the Coast Guard, and you have our commitment to always be strong supporters of the U.S. Coast Guard. That concludes the hearing.